He lives very close. He is in California with his lovely wife, Susan. And please join me in welcoming Terry Finnegan.
It's always a pleasure, James. Well, that said, from the standpoint of what we're going to see for the next couple of minutes, I'm not going to talk about warfighting. I'm not going to talk about airplanes doing their thing. This is how pilots usually communicate with you, and I can understand that. My brother was an F-15 pilot for all his career, and he had a great experience. I'm going to try to speak to you from how the combatants spoke, and this is my attempt at humor at start. To remind you that some words from French, German, and Russian will be introduced, but for the most part, just be aware that, hey, I'm not a linguist, I just happen to speak English on the side. As you've been seeing over the last several months with James' outstanding program, and I was here 2 weeks ago when Mike Hanlon talked about the Somme. The point about what you see in this war, two major fronts, obviously the Western Front, the sleeping plan is addressed here, and then you have on the Eastern Front, you have the eastern part of Germany, Russia, occupied Poland, which is part of Russia, and then you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire. What you've discovered is most intense aviation took place on the Western Front. Why? Because that was the greatest era of concentration, because the risk posed to the Allies, be it the British or the French. On the Eastern Front, you had more maneuvering room. So what discovered from working the aviation side of things, you didn't have the concentration of aircraft flying on the Eastern Front as you would have on the Western Front. But the advances were almost parallel on both fronts, despite the fact that you had less airplanes flying on the east. Yes, I want to talk about airplanes, and here are some fabulous air shots of some of them, mostly Allied. My discussion about German will come into play, but I have to be very frank. When I wrote this book in 2005, my emphasis was on the Allies because that's where I did my research, in London and Paris and in the National Archives and College Park. The wars are not a popular topic in Germany. This is a statement of fact. And so what you find is a lot of the incredible advances in aviation that was accomplished by the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians has been pushed by the wayside. World War I is a very popular topic in Britain. Anybody remember what happened last week with Mike Hanlon's talk? 1st of July, the Battle of the Somme, almost 60,000 casualties, 20 of them were killed. The Brits still take the First World War very, very seriously. So, to the victors goes the spoils. The Brits write the books about World War I. Oh, by the way, the emphasis is on what they accomplished in World War I. In fact, today, or the other day, the Smithsonian Institution has an article out about the Somme and the lessons learned, and about Pershing being still thinking anachronistically about how to employ soldiers and weapons in World War I, and needlessly sacrificing many people. The reason I bring this up in the Smithsonian discussion is the guy's a noted British historian. What he doesn't do is give you the appreciation of what the Americans learned in World War I, which was the French taught the Americans how to fight a modern war. It was not the British. So that's the hard lessons of life we have to share, and that includes aviation for the most part. Besides airframes, you have Zeppelin. And the irony with Zeppelins is obviously that was the airship of choice prior to the war. The German aviation industry was fully concentrated on Zeppelin prior to war's outbreak in 1914. And yet, it took the citizens of Germany to contribute out of their own pockets money to build aviation in Germany. The government didn't have any money. They spent all their money on Zeppelin development. And so all the airplanes, you see the Taubes and all the other airplanes that were 1914 on, were funded by personal contributions, charitable contributions by the German citizens. It's a different reality. As for this particular Zeppelin, Zeppelin 4, intriguingly enough, this is a French postcard. Unfortunately for the aircrew, in 1913, they lost their way and landed in France. And so the French obviously took a photo of this Zeppelin. This particular Zeppelin went back to Germany, and then it fought in a noble way on the Eastern Front as the Russians were advancing, and it was a very active airship over the Battle of Tannenberg in August of 1914. My friend Helmut, which I'm going to talk about throughout this briefing, is he's my German counterpart on the book we're writing. And he's uncovering all these fabulous photos. And I want you to see what we're going to talk about. I use the word third dimension to give you an appreciation for aviation. Again, it's the depth associated from the surface on up or down below. And what you have here is a balloon aviator, an air steer, with a German 120 centimeter camera. What you're seeing, look at the puzzled faces here. Those are your experienced, hardcore infantry combatants on the German front line. And they're getting an orientation of what is this thing called aerial photography. And so, to me, it says it all. Because this is what aviation's all about. They know how to fight a ground war, but they don't have a clue on what aviation can provide for them to fight a more effective ground war. So this is one of my favorite photos of all time. So my only word chart, I don't know if you can see it, just so you understand, using Wikipedia to give you an appreciation for what dimensions are. You have the first dimension, which is basically a line in space. The second dimension is the surface, the cartography, the maps, those things that you employ to understand the battle. And then the third dimension is basically the dynamic of what is the aerospace coming up from the surface, or just conversely below the surface of the Earth. And then interestingly enough, the fourth dimension is time. Because from a military intelligence perspective, the fourth dimension is critical. You've got to understand what's going on in the other dimensions and provide timely information to the combatant decision makers so that they can employ the resources in the most effective way. So let's look at the visionaries that have come about. There's lots of folks to talk about, and we don't have lots of time. But I can make it clear to you that the research uncovered a lot of names of folks that have been forgotten in history for the last 100 years. And that's the irony. To include this gentleman here, Brigadier General Sir David Henderson. Anybody know what his job was? He was the first commander of the Royal Flying Corps in 1912. Totally forgotten today. Everybody thinks of a guy named Trencher. Trencher's a great general. In fact, there needs to be a DNA test with who is the the founder of the Royal Air Force Royal Flying Corps, because it was Henderson, the first general, who evolved it. And why am I talking about him here? Because he wrote about reconnaissance. He understood reconnaissance functions and such, and in turn was one of the first to apply to aerial reconnaissance. But there's other gentlemen too. There's Sykes and a couple other players. But today, the prevailing British emphasis is that Hugh Trenchard was the father of the Royal Air Force. I would say, contraire, I think it's Sir David Henderson. Now to get down to the German side. Again, unknown because not very well experienced by the German public today. But you had very innovative leadership in Germany as involved aviation. In fact, one of the greatest leaders of the German military, Ludendorff, was one of the most innovative players for aviation. In 1912, he learned how to fly. He worked with the various aviators that were coming together at Dobritz, and Ludendorff basically was a proponent throughout the war. But it was led for the most part by Hermann von der Lief Thompson, known as Thompson. The nickname for him was Der Dicker, the fat one. His counterpart was Wilhelm Siegert. Siegert was kind of like the brainiac that understood concepts. Interestingly enough, in 1914, Siegert was trying to find a way of putting ordnance, munitions, onto Taubes, launching a fleet of Taubes across the channel to crash into Britain. 1914, folks. What does that remind you of in World War II? Yeah, that's right. 1914 innovation. Yes?
Wasn't there also a German naval captain who was running the Zeppelin program, who ended up leading the first strategic bombing of Britain through the Zeppelins?
Yeah, I don't know the guy's name.
Okay.
But you're right. The German Navy did a major play with Zeppelin.
Okay.
So, yes, both services, Navy and Army Air, whatever you want to call them, Fleet or Taiwan, they applied that airship dynamic. And obviously, that was the first of the raiding parties. And then the Goethe bombers came in 1917 and so on. All right, let's shift to the other side and think about, what's that?
No, this Sikorsky, yes.
See, the irony of ironies is that, again, we're thinking Western. Igor Sikorsky was one of the most innovative designers in the entire history of mankind. You're looking at simple, fragile airframes, single propeller, and what does he come up with in 1912? A 4-engine Ilya Muromets airplane that flies 1,000 kilometers from St. Petersburg down to Kiev and back. What we were saying about Igor Sikorsky is that his genius has been somewhat supplanted because, again, the Russians had their problems in history. But what we find from the standpoint of aerial reconnaissance is that that was probably the most successful aerial reconnaissance platform in the war. Why? Because it could fly for like 5 hours, kind of like a U-2 or an SR-71, unimpeded by the enemy, maybe flak. But there's one case in 1912, of course 1915, April 12th of 1915, where Sikorsky's Ilya Muromets, and we'll see a photo of that shortly, flew over all of East Prussia with aerial cameras running the whole time. It don't get any better than that if you're a strategic intelligence person.
Didn't they have a dark room? They had a photo lab on board the plane, right?
No, but they had a bathroom.
Photo lab?
Not on board, no.
Did he also visit the other country?
Yes, he did. Sikorsky out of
That's
Connecticut.
what we know.
Exactly. He was able to escape because his counterparts were captured at the border and executed by the Bolsheviks. My other colleague in writing the next book is Carl Balbro, and he works at Smithsonian, and his passion is Russian. So he has all the connections with Russian historians contributing to our work right now. And Carl has written articles and is very passionate about Nesterov. Why do I show this individual? Because he was killed in the opening weeks of the war flying over Austro-Hungarian airspace. Why was he such a significant player? Because he was one of the most innovative aviators in the Russian Imperial Air Service up until that time. He was one of the first ones to ever do the loop. At the same time, he was a very strong proponent for understanding the value of aerial reconnaissance. And so as the war starts over Galatian airspace, he's flying. He doesn't have the weapons on board to do air-to-air combat, but he sees a Austro-Hungarian biplane, the Avatar biplane, that had just flown over a critical part of the area where the Russian army was formed. He makes a conscious decision. He has to down that airplane, because if not, that information will get back to the Austro-Hungarian commanders and put at risk the Russian forces. So he rams the Austro-Hungarian airframe. Both planes crash. All the crew were killed. He was one of the first heroes of the Soviet Union, based on what he had accomplished in this act of courage. But he understood what aerial reconnaissance was early on, and he applied it for the rest of his time. From the standpoint of the French, my research discovered that the French, for the most part, were the leading innovative nation on aviation. They had the largest air force of any nation up until 1914. They, in turn, had very scholarly people, such as Captain Maurice Groux, who was one of the greatest advocates for developing the reconnaissance infrastructure, to include the development of aerial camera film and plates, and the processing and dissemination of that information to your battlefield commanders. He also was one of the design engineers behind the longer 120 centimeter camera. Getting back to the German side, Lieutenant Karl Fink was basically Groux's counterpart on the German side. In 1912, working with Zeiss, came up with a Pistol Kamera, which was the assigned aerial camera for the German forces as war started. None of the other combatants had that in place, and the Germans were already acquiring the cameras when the war started, thanks to Karl Fink. And he was an innovator throughout the war. How many folks have ever heard of Edward Steichen? Edward Steichen is one of the greatest photographers of all time.
Photographer, yeah.
Exactly. And if you look at art books like that, his work is championed as some of the greatest. And what Edward Steichen did was, when the war started, he was from Luxembourg originally, and then he was able to get back to the United States in 1917 when the war was declared. He became part of the Army staff because of his brilliance associated with photography. And I bring him into this discussion early on because it's Edward Steichen who gives the Americans credit for being head and shoulders with the rest of the Allies and understanding aerial photography and its role. And he basically helps organize the entire aerial photography effort that the Americans applied in 1918. And by the way, in his hand is a Flieger Kamera 4, which is a handheld German camera. And he knew his cameras. So what does this lead to? I'm not going to talk to you about Eddie Rickenbacker. I'm not going to talk to you about Baron von Richthofen. I'm going to talk to you about the aerial observer. This is the brains of the outfit. This is the guy who sat in the back of the plane, took the photographs. In this case, this is a French 26 centimeter camera, handheld, like the German one you saw. And it's also a fashion statement showing off the latest in fur apparel. Yes?
Germans basically had a fixed camera setup, whereas I'm assuming the other side more had handheld cameras, or
No,
was
all the same.
All the same.
Let me give you the inventory in a second here.
Okay.
From the standpoint of understanding the process for intelligence, you've got to acquire the intelligence. Here is a G4 flying over the lines of either directing artillery using the wireless, or they're using, they're taking aerial photography, or just basically observation roles and writing down the reports and passing them on to the headquarters. This is the earliest aerial photograph I could have seen to date on World War I. This is August of 1914, and in this particular case, that hand camera, which we'll see a photo of in a second, this is a Belgian fort. So as they're doing the maneuver, the Schlieffen-Plane maneuver through Belgium, here is one of the first shots. What Karl Fink had to go through was evolve the process. Yes, they had the camera, and yes, they taken a photograph, but they had no process in place for development or dissemination of the information, or getting the right photo to the right person at the right time. That evolved by October. So here's one of your first aerial cameras. Pistol grip. Looks good. Takes a 13 by 11 centimeter frame. Shot. Your cameras, for the most part, are glass plates. We'll talk about that shortly. But that's prevailing attitude at the time, is that film was not as exportable as glass plates. The reason being is because they had not mastered the role of film over the aperture very well. So you had a lot of electrostatic problems. So you'll see for most of the war, all the adversaries used glass plates.
On the other thing is vibration.
Well, there you are. We'll discuss that. Here is an Austro-Hungarian January 1915, and you can see the Hahn camera being applied. So yes, Germany and their allies, the Austro-Hungarians, apply their technology fairly aggressively. So let's talk about the other sides of intelligence collection of this war, because I think it's amazing to note, and this is one reason I was fascinated when I discovered what was going on with this. In my youth, I did tactical reconnaissance, and obviously you learn processes and so on and so on. When I discovered the manuals written in 1915, 1916, all the foundation for tactical reconnaissance were in those manuals. So 70 years later, we're still applying it. When a Predator drone flies around, it's all based on World War I precepts. So in the case of what are we looking at the Eiffel Tower for? This is not a commercial break for tourism. What you have is a demonstration of the role of anything possible to collect intelligence. Because of the structure of the Eiffel Tower, you had sound wave systems that were able to capture HF radio transmissions, and then in turn, below the Eiffel Tower, they were doing the analysis. So it was an intelligence system during the war. The most prolific of all the intelligence collected in World War I was from the millions of prisoners of war, because you had a bounty of understanding what exactly was going on. What was the unit these folks were from? Oh, by the way, where are the forces moving to, and so on and so on. And the prisoner of war interrogations reinforced what the aerial photography discovered. Now, by way of introducing this, what was the most feared weapon in the war, World War I?
Artillery.
I heard artillery. Anybody else? Sorry?
I said gas, but
Well, that obviously is very, very important. But artillery was the king of battle. And more casualties came from artillery. Machine gun gets all the press, and I'm not trying to take away from machine gun, or from the chemical warfare employment of gas. But the point is that artillery was the king of battle. It required the greatest amount of information to do the greatest damage. So what you do is you see, through this third dimension, an evolution of all physics. And so you take a artillery piece that fires off a round, and it creates a sound wave. And so that sound wave basically traverses across no man's land, and throughout all of no man's land, you have sensors that pick up that sound wave, and then it comes and it collates it together, and then it comes together to a computer. This is one of the world's first computers right here. So that's the impetus for the world that we live in now, is that World War I required us to become more innovative to get the data together as quickly as we could. So that collated sound data pinpoints the location of the artillery piece that's firing at you. In turn, you're able to send that information to your artillery units to do counter battery and destroy that particular enemy and artillery. Now, one of the realities of World War I was, if you've ever seen photos of the trenches and so on and so on, there wasn't very many places where antennas could stick up, because I was committed to hybrid. And that was a very important target there. So a lot of your communications that occurred underground. Again, that's the third dimension, depth from within, And what you find is the French call it, you know, the soul, without the sun. Intercepts of ground telegraphy was a major player for collecting information. What I've discovered from doing the research in the second book was the fact is that the Germans mastered this. And oh, by the way, wireless intercepts were one of their major advances. And in the battle I write about in April 1918, they had all the communication between the general officers underway, and they were starting to harass the generals as they're trying to make critical decisions. That was how good they were in World War I. So all these sources are coming together, and now you have an architecture framework by which, at the top here, you have the artillery, the aviation, the wireless, and so on and so on. I know this is an eye chart, but if you look at the book, you'll be able to see this and get an appreciation for how the information flows from the various sources, and it all comes together to the headquarters where the decision maker makes the right decision on how they want to employ forces. Again, the weapon of choice is your artillery. It is the king of battle, and every one of these shells, the millions upon millions upon millions, need to be fired with some degree of accuracy to destroy the enemy. And that's basically what it's all about, making sure those shells hit the right place. You'll know from your FAA and so on, that you just can't randomly fly anything to a place you want to. They established that control in World War I, so that every airplane that took off over the front lines basically had a particular place that they needed to operate from. What this chart shows is you have areas of responsibility. This is basically the front line. Charlie, Delta, and Echo are the divisional sectors responsible from the front line, from no man's land. These are divisional units. Then Foxtrot is your core, which goes up about 10 miles from the front line. And beyond that, in the Gulf sector, that's your strategic. So that's where your long-range plan and everything else occurs from aviation. So if you're going to take off and you're going to do reconnaissance, if you're in this sector here, right against the front line, you're basically supporting those divisions in the immediate battle. But then if you're going beyond that to the core sector, you're helping numbers of divisions with any major operations or reinforcements that are going to occur in the battle that's on the way. And then again, strategic gives you an appreciation for what is the sustainability of that particular battle. So the collected information that from the front line, you have your aerial balloons, your captive balloons as they call them. And this is probably the most famous one that was shot in the war. This is a French design, the Coquet balloon. And the Germans obviously decided this was a better way to inflate and fly. What I discovered from doing the research is that the Germans had balloons committed to the various arms, artillery balloons, infantry balloons, and so on and so on. The Americans and the French basically had their balloons covering this division at large. Showed a specific role for this particular line. Obviously, you've got a front row seat. It isn't a job I'd like to have, but from the standpoint of what you see, they're about 1,000 meters up in altitude where they observed from. They have telephone lines going down from the balloon station to the ground out to the command centers. So they had real-time information collection and dissemination. Remember that photograph of the German balloonist with the infantry officers? Here's an example of this 120 centimeter camera being deployed from their particular station. Again, you're getting real-time information to your combatants. Yes?
What, about 25 miles at that range or less than 5?
It depends on the altitude.
Yeah, but the capability of that lens would be...
Well, 120 centimeters is a pretty good focal length.
Yeah.
And, oh, by the way, what's important too is see the oblique. This is not a vertical, it's an oblique. So if you get photographs from an oblique, you give it to that infantry guy and say, here's your battlefield that you got to traverse. Because most of your imagery was direct vertical, which meant you can apply it to a map. But this tells you, when you got to have light coverage, of how you're going to have to traverse the ground. Yes? Had a question? Okay. Now, obviously, aviators had to learn their job too, which meant they had to understand the mechanics of cameras and so on. And as it got more sophisticated, flying a rigid course was very, very dangerous. But that's part of the testament to the commitment, the valor of the aviators that were not the pursuit pilots. They had a much more arduous job, more dangerous job. And for the Americans, the rule was always face German. If you're going to take a photograph, always make sure it's on the German lines. We don't need to know what's going on our side. So here we are, we're flying a mission, and this is the area of coverage. So you have this particular, that 120 centimeter camera, very detailed. And then you have the 50 centimeter camera, which is a standard imaging camera system. And then your panoramic or your smaller focal length cameras like a 26 gives you a broader area. So let's go with the best first. The German cameras, because of Zeiss, they were very sophisticated. They understood the process early on, what it required for aerial photography. Again, these are plate cameras. Here's your 120, here's your 70, here's your 50 centimeter, here's your handheld 26 or 25. Here's the French inventory. Again, 120 centimeter, here's a 50 centimeter, and they have 52 as well, 26. And by August of 18, they started bringing it on film. I would venture to say that the Allies became more interested in film thanks to a guy named George Eastman, because he emphasized, I can make it work for you from aerial photography. To give you an appreciation of what the 120 centimeter looks like from the cockpit view, basically, here's this guy, he's got to do two jobs. There's the pilot, he's flying the plane. The aerial observer's got to defend the plane. At the same time, he's got to operate the camera.
Is that like a Farman or something?
Yeah, this is a Maurice Farman 11.
Okay.
11 bis. Now, this is an OSHA study on how to put a camera into the cockpit. And it's a very arduous task, and here's your Farman. But that's the point about all this. This was their entire purpose from aviation standpoint, is making sure those cameras were successfully loaded on there, they worked, because why put yourself at risk if you're not going to have that system work? Here's a SPAD 11, same sort of thing, smaller 50 centimeter camera, going into the observer's cockpit, and then you can see his Hotchkiss gun in the back. The Americans come to play. They don't, for the most part, use anything but French cameras. This is a Durand camera that Steichen thought was very good. It had 50 plates. It's about 100 pounds of weight, so you couldn't fly it off of most of the airframes. You had to get into a pretty large, effective designed airplane, such as a Samsung. So here's the pride and joy of this particular reconnaissance unit. You have the Durand camera, then you have the 450 centimeters, then you have a modified 26 centimeter called a Grand Champ, and then your standard 26. And oh, by the way, in the background, that's the development lab.
Yeah.
Here are the British inventories. Again, I don't want to cast aspersion on the Brits. They did remarkably well with what they could do and what they had. They didn't have the industry for high quality glass like the Germans did, to a degree the French did. So they're at the mercy of the French during the war of getting the high quality glass to build their cameras. In fact, in the book, as well as in the studies, the British sent up a call to all the citizens, turn in your cameras. We need to use the lenses off of your cameras for our aerial cameras. So a lot of folks turned in their Brownie Kodaks or whatever, just so they could use those lenses. So that's how serious it was for the folks in Britain. That was their first camera, the Type A. They followed up by the Type C. Then the first metal frame was the Type E. And then this was the most successful of their cameras, which was the Type L. And then you have a semi-automatic camera called the DM, and that bigger camera was able to take a lot of photographs without the use of an aerial observer, and it allowed the pilot more independence. The Russians had their own suite of cameras. Most notably was the Ulyanin. There's 3 lenses here. It was developed before the war. And one of the reasons why it's fascinating to know about the Russians, they had the innovation, they just didn't have the industrial capacity. So they couldn't mass produce the airframes. So a lot of their airplanes were French. You know, by the way, the Sikorsky airframes, the Ilium Mirmits, they were held up. A lot of internecine warfare between the general staffs and so on. So it's a sad statement about the Russians. They had innovation, but they didn't have production. This is what an Ulyanin camera shot looked like. Fairly good resolution. It also included a clock, and it also included a barometer to give you the exact altitude of that particular shot. So let's look at the airplanes for a second. Okay, here's your Ilium Mirmits. 4-engine. Biggest problem with the Ilium was the fact that the engines that were applied in 1913, 1914 were made in Germany. So they had to develop their own engines or get it from the French. But they were very successful platforms. Again, I mentioned the April 12, 1915 sortie, where they flew all over East Prussia unimpeded. They had the Ulyanin camera and another film camera on board, just taking shots away. For those who know Manfred von Richthofen, obviously a fabulous aviator, you know, he's still the most visible presence of aviation from the Great War, thanks to Charlie Brown and that sort of thing. But when you think about it, what was his major targets? It was the airframes associated with air reconnaissance. And the British experimental BE was the primary airframe for collection. It was an airframe developed by a committee, which meant it flew slow and stable. So it wasn't a very maneuverable plane. When you got a Baron von Richthofen kind of guy after you, you're basically out of luck. But that was part of the process. And this was in 1912-13 when they developed that airframe. This is one of the first of them. And then by 1917, they started getting them out of the inventory. It was like a Foxtrot variant by that time. So here's the Maurice Farman 11 front shot. Here's the crew. It gives you an appreciation. Again, they want that oblique look so they can plan the advance of the forces and with a 120 centimeter. And you can see they did this jerry-rigged the frame so they could hold the camera up. Here's a Russian. There's a French design. It's a Marine Solner 4. The French didn't fly this. They sold it to the Russians. And oh, by the way, here's the aviator, and there's the Ulyanin camera being brought to the cockpit. What you find when looking at the German suite of air reconnaissance, it's like a Mercedes. They just look good. And the design of German airframes throughout the war was very effective. They could take a hit, they could fly fairly steadily, and oh, by the way, they had the best cameras. In this case, this is an Avatac on the Galatian front. The British applied a lot of designs to make sure that collection was successful. This is a fighter experimental, FE2, and it's been configured for reconnaissance. And this is the camera on the left side. For the most part, a lot of the British cameras were hung on the side of the plane, not internally. The exception being was one of the workhorses for the Royal Air Force, which was the Reconnaissance Experimental 8, RE8. Sorry?
No, I was 8 down and down the center.
Yep. Now my caption in my book for this shot is do or die. They don't look very happy. But what's interesting, the crew of the mechanics look more desperate than the pilot and the observer. One of the best planes in the war was the Brigade, 142A. Those guys, this is the first Brigade escadrille that came online, and they looked pretty confident. And it was a very well designed, it was durable infrastructure, so it was a very well-built airframe. The beauty of the Brigade was that it could have multiple missions. Not only was it used for air reconnaissance, but also it was the main airframe for bombing in 1917, 1918. On the German side, here's a later version of an aerial reconnaissance and also a ground attack plane, the DFWCV. This is a very well-built airplane. It can take a lot of hits. And in my second book, I talked about this plane being employed in ground strafing ops. One of the things you find is that aviation not only goes higher, but they are able to operate at lower altitudes to provide ordnance against the advancing infantry. Now let's talk about American influence on aviation. We owe our understanding about aviation not to the Brits. I love the Brits, don't get me wrong, but almost totally to the French. It's the French who taught the Americans how to fly in terms of flying in the combat environment. You had a couple of Americans who were able to fly with the Brits and so on, but it's the French who deserve the credit. And that's one of the sad ironies, is that this isn't a discussion about freedom fries or any political nonsense. It's about who we owe credit to for making us a modern army and a modern air force. And so you can see, we work very well with the French. Now, how many folks have ever heard of Beale Air Force Base? Ever been up to Beale? Guess what? Beale is the home of reconnaissance. The first Aero Squadron basically ended up in Beale. And this is an airframe with the American flag as our emblem. A Samson 2A2, which was one of the best airplanes ever built, World War I. It could take a hit very well. In this case, instead of the turret in the back having a gun, they had a ground shot camera, so you could do more effective aerial photography. Lieutenant Irwin from the first Aero Squadron shot down 9 German airplanes as the pilot of a Samson. He did a great job. So,
Okay.
sorry?
Yeah, because you normally associate fighter pilots as a single engine, one guy.
Right.
But in the First World War, they were actually given credit for shooting down Jackson's side.
And that's just, again, it's part of that history.
Right.
You know, we don't give the credit to where it actually occurred unless you do the research, do the deep dive. It's popular literature that basically covers. You've got to understand, this is the true air war of World War I. Now, obviously, everybody wants to see a SPAD, and this is the Pat Lorraine Squadron, which was what Eddie Rickenbacker was so honorably assigned with, and he shot down his 26 airplanes, mostly flying SPADs. But look at the way the SPAD is configured. This is a fighter plane now. And look at the panel in the back, see the word photo. Why is this significant for our discussion? Because the French designed airframes with reconnaissance in mind. Even your fighter planes, such as the SPAD, had to have the internal bay to hold a camera. And it was employed for fast reconnaissance. So there's a dear friend of mine, Alan Tooley, up in Seattle. He is the world's foremost expert on SPADs. He hates the thought of a SPAD being lowered from an air-to-air combat plane to a reconnaissance plane. We have this discussion all the time. In fact, he had never seen this photo, but here is a SPAD, and look at the back here, you see the camera. Now, anybody want to guess what this is? You had mentioned it before. Stabilizing the camera.
And vibration.
Guess what? Anybody want to venture a guess what this is? This is the French design.
Spindle.
Sorry?
I'm saying it's spindle.
Close. It's tennis balls. That's how they were able to reduce the motion of the camera as it's flying through the second.
Goodness.
Here's Gilliam Airmets. The mission that folks want to remember is it was a very effective bomber. And here's a very large bomb. And here's Sikorsky. And this gentleman here is the general in charge of the force that flew the Gilliam Airmets. Shidlovsky is his name. When the war ended, he was trying to escape through to Finland. The Bolsheviks executed him on the spot. Thank you for your service.
Yes.
Here is the way, for the most part, aerial photography was developed, basically in a mobile van. You had some labs, but for the most part, it was done as closely to the airfield as possible, and then the information was disseminated as quickly as possible. This is the only glass plate I've ever held in my hand. It gives you an appreciation of the detail of what you can get from a glass plate. It requires coverage of the battlefield. And all those little pot marks are artillery figures. Photographs of what you're seeing here. This was a standard for the most part at the beginning of the war, 11 by 13, and then the later part of the war was 13 by 24, and that became the standard for everybody. The Brits had their own standard up until 1918, and then under the Supreme War panel, they made it clear that all allies have the same processes for developing and dissemination. So when photographs are taken, I'm not a photo expert, but obviously you put in chemicals and so on and so on, and you got to hang them out to dry. And use whatever you can to do to make that happen. In the case of intelligence, what you find here is one of the first intelligence processes of aerial photography. This is a German photograph of a French fort. Note the date, October 1914. Yes, we discussed the fact that they were taking photos before October, but not only are you getting fairly good resolution of the photo of the target, you're also providing a companion line drawing with a lot of information on what exactly that particular photograph entails. And that becomes the mainstay for aerial photography. Here, for example, a French aerial photograph. See these lines here? That's all barbed wire. Those are the vast fields of barbed wire that the enemy infantry had to try to get through to advance onto the enemy front lines. And then here's the company line drawing, so for anybody seeing what they have, they can see immediately, hey, here's the trenches, and here's the barbed wire in front of those trenches. Yes?
Isn't the turning point for the ordinary military, mainline military, appreciating reconnaissance when I think it's British and French aerial reconnaissance reveals that the German army has turned in front of Paris instead of going around it and exposed its flank? And that's when who's it?
You're talking about the First Marine.
Yeah, Joffre and Gallieni together decide that we're going to take them in the flank, and that's what kept the Schlieffen. That's what wrecked the Schlieffen plan, right?
No, I wish I could take credit for that in terms of that interest in the item. No. Aerial photography did not play that vital role then.
Well, not the photography,
But aerial reconnaissance.
Yeah, the aerial reconnaissance, right?
In my book, you have the German army advancing on Mons. And what happens is you have the British forces roll contemptibles at Mons. And they haven't had their major battle yet. And if it hadn't been for aerial reconnaissance, discovering that the Corps was in a certain location near the town of Ath, ATH, which is about 10 miles away from Mons, then you would have had the encirclement of the British Army and the destruction of the British Army in August of 1914. Because of aerial reconnaissance, that was the most decisive event, because everything that followed after that, don't get me wrong, the modern being what it was, and the gap associated between the British and the French and the German army gap started to expand, and they were able to take advantage of that. Yeah, that was contributed by aerial reconnaissance Oh, by the way, also from radio wireless intercepts. Because they were able to find out that the Germans said, we got to move out of this particular place. And so they triangulated the wireless intercepts, and they were able to get the exact location of where those enemy forces were, and didn't exploit the opportunity. But the discoveries that I came up with the Moans encirclement, the Brits paid credit to that. In fact, there's a Britain at War magazine, and the greatest compliment I've gotten from the research was they featured my book in 2014, the first of the major World War I editions, and they said, they stated what I just described to you, and they said, this is an exceptional book. So I said, when you get it from the Brits, thank you. If only they'd paid a better royalty. So let's look at another battlefield shot. Try to do the analysis on this. But let's be frank. If you're doing day by day by day of the same location, you're going to find footpaths. And that's basically how accurate the analysis became with aerial photography. Notice the words, tracks. They're able to figure out where the enemy is walking as involved. And oh, by the way, if they go into a particular place, that means it's not the area of high interest. Maybe that's where all the senior officers congregate. So let's target that. Last but not least, from an aerial photography standpoint, here's your front lines right here. Every square inch is analyzed. And then in the rear echelon areas, you have your congregation areas where they basically come together, and then they go down the communication trenches to the front lines. So these are very important. Light shot is the name of it. And that's where they wanted to target that extensively during the war because they didn't want to be able to reinforce the ongoing battle. And here you can see they call it a typical strong point. But that's the analysis that you see underway. When you're flying an airplane, you're taking a photograph. And so with each shot, you get basically a continual line of photography, but you don't have that camera system to show that particular photography. So what you do is you create mosaics. And we did mosaics in 1979 when I was stationed in Britain with NATO forces. And that's part and parcel of the process. In 1916, the Germans came up with an ion derivative camera, which was film strips. And here you see the entire area being covered by film strips. So you're collecting all this photography, but how do you manage it so that you don't waste lives and aviation resources over the same target area? You basically start plotting on maps what are the photographs that you have and where are they stored, so that if you need to see this particular point, you don't have to send another airplane up. You just go to the history of coverage, which is still true today the way we do reconnaissance analysis. But here's one of the first of the key maps, as they call it. All the adversaries apply it. Now, the Somme sector, which we're talking about, this is all aerial coverage from German airplanes in the month of May. What made the Germans very effective was not only that they had better camera systems, but also, too, their Rumplers were able to fly safely at 20,000 feet. So if you read Eddie Rickenbacker's book, he talks about trying to shoot down a Rumpler. Well, when he gets to about 70,000 feet, he doesn't have the air to hold up the airplane. He can't aim the machine gun. So here's the Rumpler flying straight and level with high-resolution long focal length cameras to get broad swaths of coverage. And here is the case in point. The book that I wrote talks about this sector and the Western Front. Oh, by the way, here are the key maps associated with it. They were trying to cover opposite the German lines, be it Gruppe Heidenau or Gruppe Gordons. And my book talks about this place right here, a place called Sacramento. But what they're trying to do is they want to determine, okay, here's the battle line right here. what's going on in the rear echelons. Because if you're going to cause a major operation to come forth, you want to make sure that you don't see any reinforcements going up. So you've got to plan the battle effectively. So to do that, you work off the maps. So let's go to the second dimension, the surface. Make sure you understand how all the forces and the topography are configured. And then what you do with the maps is you start exploiting them. Because what you want to do is you want to know where all the threats are. The prevailing attitude of intelligence in the First World War was there was a focus on the unit designation. Because that gave you an appreciation for what kind of forces were opposite you. And now in our case, if I said there was a force of Texans as opposed to a force of Californians as part of the front, you might make a decision that the Texans are much more effective fighting force. Well, likewise, if I said these are Rhenish fighters or as opposed to Prussian or whatever, same intelligence analysis being made on where your adversaries are. That exploitation carried throughout the war. From the standpoint of aerial photography, everybody's an expert when you look at a photograph. Here's a photo processing crew, and they're giving you your 5 cents worth of, well, there's the Germans right here, they're just doing their thing. That's just the way it was until. And then you start doing a hardcore analysis. You have the optics to examine each piece of the photo, make sure you get the right depth of interpretation. And true to form, like everybody else, there's interest from everybody. Hey, where's those photos I took? Well, get out of the office. We're doing our job. And that was the reality even to this day. The other process, like the Ryan building framework I showed you, you're trying to capture the third dimension. So when you look at this photograph of Ypres, you'll see, because it's not the same photograph, it's a little bit of an overlap, that if you look at it through this stereo optic, now the surfaces come up. That gives you that third dimension, that depth, that helps you do the analysis necessary to do more inspection of how the front or the enemy is configured. If you're looking at the trenches, you basically have the line configuration of the traverses. And if you go to the Hindenburg line, which is one of the most formidable defenses on the Western Front, you get an appreciation for how those defenses are arrayed. Oh, by the way, a lot of them were configured by 1718 to take on what major weapon system? Tank. Exactly. So your trenches became wider. So if the tank went in there, it didn't get out. Targets of interest. You're flying over an airfield or a facility of interest, and you see the Red Cross. That was agreed that, hey, this is a hospital, so please don't drop ordnance on there. Throughout the Western, and to a lesser degree the Eastern Front, you had networks of road and rail to resupply the entire ongoing battle. So here's one rail net. What do you see there? Camouflage net. We basically camouflaged the entire Western Front by 1918. Camouflage became the order of the day. Here's a drone G4 unit. Here's the hangars. They're somewhat camouflaged. You can see that here. So airfields, trench lines, everything. But it also became an interesting part of warfare. You're trying to deceive your adversary through the employment of effective camouflage or deception. So what you have is, in this case, a French camoufleur whose job it was to confuse the enemy's analysis of what was in the front line sector. Andre Marr was the gentleman's name. Now, anybody want to venture a guess is what this kind of art reminds you of?
Cubism?
Amen. Picasso. The cubism of that era became a very important part of the way they thought how to deceive the enemy. to look at that route, that doesn't look like anybody. But then if you understand the logic behind that particular art, now you see the value. And that's basically how camoufleurs operated. And here is the chameleon. Reminds me of that Woody Allen movie, Zelig. Change your spots. That was a symbol for the camoufleurs. One of my greatest discoveries from doing the research on the second book was this shot. At the National Archives in the Garber facility, Edward Steichen has a photo album. And this photo was in the photo album. My book's about this place called Sedgebury, April 1918. This is a composite photograph developed by the Intelligence Fusion Center of the Germans in the front lines. This is recent coverage, like about 17 April 1918. In other words, 2 days before the actual operation occurs. With all the significant targets in place, and they developed that, and then they got it out to the artillery, they got it out to the infantry in their advancement, and so on and so on. That's how sophisticated information intelligence was being created, produced, analyzed, and disseminated in a timely fashion throughout this war. It's kind of like today, if you use the analogy of real-time predator ops in the Middle East. Real time. There's that bad guy. Get the kill order, destroy him, goodbye. So the information that was being acquired from all the sources of intelligence, all the weapon systems, all the lines of communication, all the infrastructure associated with that battlefield became part of the map. For the French, they call it the Plan de Raptor. It was produced on a daily basis. All the key threats were posted on the map. And then you have it applied. Here again, there's that legend again. Broad field. For that Somme battlefield everybody's talking about, this is one of the plan directors from the Somme battlefield. All the colors have a purpose. At the time, the French trench lines were in red, and the enemy German trench lines were in blue. And then if we went up the road to a British map, the British trench lines were in blue, and the German lines were in red. And finally, in August of 18, they said, let's get our act together. And so they went to the blue as the ally and the red as the enemy. From the standpoint of information to feed the artillery, the French call it the Reconnaissance, which is the artillery fire map. And basically, all the information is coming in, they want to pinpoint where those guys are. In this case, not only are you able to observe what the locations are of the artillery pieces, this is artillery replacement 4040. The symbology said maybe it was a 155 millimeter gun. That's how accurate, how detailed the information became. And so as you're fighting your battles in World War I, you're trying to destroy the artillery in place. In this case, firing this 155 millimeter Schneider against the German threat. Beyond artillery, you had aerial bombardment. This is an actual target folder. It's more of the psychedelic color of its youth. The symbology associated with aerial targeting was, what are the targets that you're going to possibly destroy? What's the most important? 3 rings. Secondary, and that's important, but don't worry about it if you don't get it. And then you fly to the mission, and you drop the bomb. Or you drop several bombs. And kind of wrapping up the discussion of intelligence, one of the discoveries about looking at the role of intelligence collection, particularly with aviation, was the analysis associated with rail networks. Why would that be significant to you on the front lines?
Because that's how your logistical support that enables attack or defense to be deployed.
Sustainability. When they started doing strategic analysis, okay, the railroad line just came into this town 20 miles from the front. How many shells are in each car, or how many people. They talk about the standard 42 people or 8 horses in the French car. Point is, that analysis all applied to the strategic understanding of how this war was going to continue. And what's important about this chart is this is the month of May to June in the sector which I wrote about, and they're saying, look at all the traffic that's coming in here. We're seeing a lot more traffic. And oh, by the way, what's scary for the Germans is most of it's American. Speaking of American, we saw the Samsung 2A2. Here is a German aerial photograph of where that base was in this sector. In this case, May 17, 1918. Possible flak there, but these are the hangars, and then you can see little red dots showing airplanes, or up here green dots, where they have area of interest in the various airplanes, in this case SPAD-11s and AR-1s. So let's go back to the third dimension discussion. When you look at the stereo coverage acquired by massive collection from aerial photography, again, that three-dimensional look, and you're able to defeat the camouflage deception operations, or you're able to discover, thanks to that three-dimensional look, what is actually going on there. The stereoscope then became labeled as the deadliest weapon of the war. Hence the discussion of coming around to why third dimension, because you now have an understanding beyond the surface of what is the evolving battle. So before we fade away, a few thoughts on other incredible people. Captain René Racal was one of the leaders for French aerial artillery regiment. One of the saddest stories is most of these folks just made a major breakthrough and they were killed in non-combatant situations. In his case, he was killed in aircraft around the airfield. Commandant Paul Louis Violet. How many folks ever heard of this guy? In 1950, he was one of the world's richest people. And when I was doing a Google search, when I was doing research, the only thing that came up was he was the owner of one of the world's largest diamonds. After the war, Violet started major play in owning French aviation industries. And I think he was responsible for the French engines for aviation, which led into transcontinental and so on and so on. But if you look at his chest, he received every possible award that France could bestow on a combatant. The Legion of Honor, the Croix de Guerre, about 20 of them. He got the Military Cross for working with the Brits in Italy for a few weeks. An incredibly brave person. Oh, by the way, he was Jewish. And so when the World War II came around, he barely escaped that problem. He was able to escape France. And he came back and built the French aviation industry after the war. But Violet was from Alsace area. And interesting enough, as his family grew and everything else in the late 50s like that, he was able to get his granddaughter married to royalty in the House of Luxembourg. But he died about 1960, and he had one of his best friends, Richard Nixon. Let's look at this guy for a second. More Brabazon. You're looking at one of the first aviation pioneers of Britain. He flew the first airplane in Britain in 1909, or 1907. He was a legend in his own mind, not in his own mind, he was a legend in so many ways, because the fact is he not only was an aviation pioneer for the Brits, he also was the one who developed the role of aviation by improving its abilities prior to the war. And then the war came, and what they did was they assigned him to RAF 3 Squadron, or Royal Flying Corps 3 Squadron, with other smart guys, and he helped develop the British aerial reconnaissance program to include the role of aerial photography. He didn't actually, he partially designed Type A, but his most important role is he built the entire infrastructure for interpretation. and developed the manuals that the Brits and the Americans and other allies used. After the war, he ran for Parliament, won. His statue is still maintained. He was Churchill's Ministry of Transportation in World War II. Was basically asked to leave after he said, we ought to let the Germans and the Russians fight it out. We got to take a back row. And obviously, Winston Churchill couldn't allow that. I had the pleasure of meeting his grandson, who is a Lord Brabazon. We got a personal tour of the House of Lords from Lord Brabazon. So it was one of the thrills of a lifetime. His counterpart was Frederick Laws. He was one of the first aviators as an enlisted man. He helped develop one of the first aerial cameras that the British used. He, in turn, was a mainstay of development and developed the Type L, which was the best camera the British employed in World War I. World War II, he was able to continue on. And then after World War II, he earned a living by developing cameras for Greyhound racetracks. In conclusion, I'll sign off with one story that I think is fascinating. Again, it's amazing how history has so many incredible stories that have been forgotten. In this case, you have an aviator, an American aviator, who, by the way, was a Marine, Ken Colbert, who, by the way, was a Harvard grad. How many Harvard grads do you know became Marines? But the point from all this is, Ken Colbert, as he was heading over to France, thought about, maybe I can become an aviator. I'm interested. So he went through school in France, became an aerial observer, and then in turn was assigned to the 1st Aero Squadron. And this guy was brilliant. He was an incredible combatant, warrior, at the same time very aware of what the war was all about. He trained with the French escadrille from February to late March of 1918. And on his time off, he went into the front lines because he wanted to know exactly what was going on. So in the Battle of Sacramento, which I write about, he and his pilot, Barney Barnaby, did an amazing sortie, flying low to the ground, causing disruption, doing artillery adjustments on enemy artillery, finding out where the machine guns were, taking on logistics infrastructure in the back, in one basic sortie, and he got the Croix de Guerre. This was the first Marine aviator to be honored for warfare in the history of the Marine Corps. How many Marines knew about this before I did the research? Not a lot. So Terry calls up the Department of History from the Marine Corps. I want to do some work on Colbert. You got anything? Ooh. I said, let's talk about it for a second. I explained to him what I understood from my research. So that was one of the most exciting things, was Air Force telling a Marine their history. So in this case, I was able to have that amazing experience. And I have an article coming out on Over the Front in the Summer Time on Colbert. So I'll sign off with a couple other key players. This is one of my favorite shots of the entire experience, besides the Germans looking at the 110, the 210 camera, is Sergeant Howell. Now, I had a chance to talk to the Air Force captain. And here it is, I show this as part of my briefing. And a cadet stands up and says, "Is that a ray gun?" No, that's okay. Keep thinking. Just so you are aware, I pay tribute to all the aviators, but there's, from doing the research, a few folks have been overlooked in terms of their accomplishments in the war from an intelligence standpoint. Outmont Herman McCorney was a SIGINT man. The Austro-Hungarians were totally being destroyed in World War I, because he was able to not only capture the radio transmissions of the Russians, he was able to decipher it in a timely manner. And then you look at the Russian Austro-Hungarian history, you find over and over and over, thanks to what he did, they were able to make the right maneuvers and save their forces. And the Austro-Hungarians had a lot of problems. They had 12 separate cultures, 12 separate languages, so it was an amazing conglomerate. But the point is, I want to pay tribute to that man from what he accomplished. All right, last shots. It's all about the guys who process the film and put it together. And here's your Photoshop in the 1920 variant. But from what we're seeing here, a lot of talent went into doing the work that we're discussing. And it's all been overlooked. And I just want to make sure everyone understands that there's more to aviation than the Betty backers or the Baron Air programs. This is my book. This is the 3rd edition. There's me with Carl Baldor from the Smithsonian. He's my Russian connection. Helmut Jaeger, an ex-Fiat G91 pilot. He's the world's expert on German reconnaissance and the cameras. And that guy right out here. But we're almost done with book 1 of 1914, talking about Tannenberg and stuff like that. It's an amazing story. So with that, this show's over.